On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Meg Henry. She's the head of people and talent at Companyon Ventures. We're going to be talking about spending more time on the onboarding process. Obviously, a lot of time is spent in the hiring process, sometimes not as much in the onboarding process. And we're going to get into that, ask why, where's the ROI, what happens if you have a weak onboarding process, and what do you do if something goes wrong and you have to take those remedial steps and going to look back and wish she had listened to this podcast episode. Meg. All right, Meg, thanks for being on the show. I think this is going to be a great topic. I appreciate the time.
Yes, thank you so much, Amir. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Companyon Ventures, obviously, before we start, what do you guys do over there?
Yeah, so at Companyon, we invest in B2B software businesses in what we call the early expansion stage. So what that means is we're typically targeting companies who have strong product market fit and at least $1 million in ARR, which from our perspective means they're ready to scale. And then we're industry agnostic, so our portfolio is a wide range of companies. So anything from fintech to transportation infrastructure to live events. We touch a little of everything. And then I'm our head of people and talent, and I'm part of what we call our expansion team. And we consider that to be our secret weapon in supercharging our company's growth. And so with that, I specifically support our portfolio companies on all things people and talent as they scale.
Awesome. All right. So we're going to be talking about onboarding. Obviously, I know a lot of times, a lot of conversations around hiring. That's where there's a lot of easy visibility. Onboarding obviously deserves maybe equal, if not more, visibility. And let's talk about that. I guess when you're, as a head of people and talent, when you look at the two processes, the hiring, the onboarding, obviously they're linked. Do we spend a little bit more time or a little bit less time on one or the other? What do you see?
Yeah, so I see people spending much more time on the hiring process than onboarding. By necessity, I guess, you're probably always going to spend more time on hiring than onboarding. But what I often see is people neglecting onboarding. So that's what I like to talk about. That's what I like to remind managers and founders about. The why, hiring is a time-intensive process, right? You're figuring out what you're trying to hire, who you're trying to hire, and you're figuring out all of the steps of the process and really who the right person is. So there is going to be a lot of time spent on that. I just want to make sure that people are focusing on also, once the offer letter is signed, once you have this person in the door, making sure that you're setting them up for success so that you're not going back and doing this a couple of months later, right? So oftentimes we're spending 2 to 3 months on that hiring process. I'm not advocating for spending an equal amount of time on onboarding, but oftentimes people aren't spending much time, if any time on it at all. So really saying, okay, let me sit down so that when this person starts on their first day, they're feeling like they're thought of. They're feeling like they know what they're going to be doing in their first week, their first 30, 60, 90 days, their first 6 months, right? So that they know how to be successful. So I'm not going out and having to do that especially long hiring process again.
So obviously that's great insight. And I guess when you're looking at the component when people are first joining a company, I like to think it's maybe a bit of an awkward phase, right? People are just joining. They're trying to find their way. They're not sure if something was covered, who to ask. They don't want to look like they weren't paying attention, right? They don't want to seem like, oh, they said this and I missed it. That process, that awkward phase for an employee, making them feel comfortable and having things be accessible. I think that accessible component sometimes is hard to understand because you have to maybe meet them where they're at. How do you enable that accessibility?
Yeah, so I think it's really thinking about what do you need in your day-to-day life to get your job done, right? So most of the resources probably exist. They're just linked somewhere in a Google Drive or in Slack or in the company's intranet or somewhere, right? So really thinking through your day, your week, and kind of coming up with, hey, this is what I need to get things done. I'm going to give this to my new hire so that when they have a question about the cadence of stand-up for the marketing team, they're able to look at the doc that we created to kind of walk through all of this or whatever it may be that they're trying to look at, and really just thinking through that. it's not a super time consuming process. And I think that's oftentimes where we get sort of overwhelmed a little bit. It's not, though. It's really just being thoughtful for probably about maybe 30 minutes for this particular task to say, how can I set this person up for success? So they're not having to come to me with all of these questions that they can refer back to the stock. They're inevitably going to come to you with questions, right? But the questions they'll ask will be the harder ones, the more strategic ones, the ones that they can't answer by themselves.
Is hybrid make that even more challenging?
Absolutely. It used to be you would sit next to somebody and you could just say, hey, where can I find this? Where can I find that? Now it takes a little bit extra to send somebody a Slack message and ask somebody to get on a Zoom meeting for a question that oftentimes a new hire, they don't know if that's a good question or they don't know if it's a stupid question, right? And no questions are really stupid, right? But it's that kind of hill that you have to get over to reach out to somebody to ask something. So much easier when you're in person and you can really just kind of talk through things. Hybrid makes it hard.
What do you see for companies that are successful, that have good onboarding processes? What are some of those main pillars that you need to focus on?
Yeah, the best onboarding processes are a combination of two things: company onboarding and orientation. So getting oriented with the product, the teams, company cadence, like things like how often are we doing all hands, that kind of a thing, right? And that tends to be at a little bit of a larger organization. So I primarily work with companies that are post-seed, pre-Series A, Series A stage, right? You're not usually seeing orientation at that stage. Usually when they're bringing on their first or second HR person, Series B, Series C, that's when you're starting to see it. But it can be hugely valuable for employees and just helping to get them ramped up faster on the company as a whole. And then the other side of things, which is really the necessity, is role-specific onboarding. So what do I need to do to be successful in my first 30 days, in my first 60 days, my first 90 days? And managers setting that up to say, okay, this is what you're looking to achieve in your first 30 days. Let me work backwards. Who do you need to meet with to get that, to learn more about that thing or get that thing done? Again, oftentimes at the earlier stage, if you don't have that supplemental company on orientation, you're also looking at how do you help a new hire understand more about a product? How do you help them understand about the sales process? So weaving that into, but it's kind of, those are the best, a combination of those two things.
I like that. That's a good baseline. I guess if you're looking at startups, you're looking at obviously lots of time, as you mentioned, is spent in that hiring process, lots of efforts put in there, onboarding. A lot of times founders, the hiring team, just thrilled not to be interviewing anymore. They're relieved. They're like, this is fantastic. We can actually do more. The onboarding process might be accelerated. It might be viewed differently because they are very interested in just having someone hit the ground running. That relationship, that dynamic of, as the people leader, the HR, the talent leader responsible for onboarding, and then the hiring team really want to get somebody injected and going, those sometimes might not work as in hand as they should. Talk about that relationship and what can be done to maybe improve it.
Yeah, so we were talking about improving, like the idea that it's like, I just want somebody who can jump in and hit the ground running. Like they shouldn't need onboarding.
Well, no, I think onboarding sometimes is accelerated because people are trying to get them working, ramp up quickly, just get them on board. And I think there is a notion of needing the hiring manager, the team they're going to, as you mentioned, sometimes this role specific onboarding, to understand that those 30, 60 days, we've talked about the challenges, the awkwardness, that they do need to slow down to let this person actually absorb the non-technical aspects of the role.
Yeah. So the idea of, I just want someone to come in and plug and play and hit the ground running day one, and I don't want to spend time on XYZ. It's generally onboarding when we're talking about it, but it can be kind of a range of things, is something that I constantly am hearing from founders and from managers. And what I like to say is giving them, like, I think of it as like you're giving new hires a map to get somewhere quicker, right? Like before navigation systems, you would never invite somebody over to your house and say, hey, come over, but figure out how to get there, right? Even if they're your like best, most autonomous friend who can figure things out, which is the type of people we're looking for in these startups, right? You're going to send them over, and I'm dating myself a little bit, but you're going to send them over like a list of instructions, like turn right at the barn, turn left at the gas station, that kind of a thing, right? And so what I say to founders and managers is you're actually accelerating that ramp up process by pointing them in the right direction. And all of these things, right? You've presumably been here for a year, 2 years. You know how to find all of these different things. Why would you send someone out into the wild and say, hey, figure it out yourself, right? Because the point of all of this, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the point of all of this is to keep the business running as fast as possible, to get things done as quick as possible. We're in a startup, we're in an environment where you need to get as much done as possible in the same amount of time that we all have, 24 hours in a day. And so really it's about accelerating that. So spending a little bit of time to help kind of grease the wheels for that new hire, to help them dive in and move faster.
Absolutely. And I guess, on the business side, if you are a leader and maybe onboarding isn't as valued as it should be, or maybe it's just viewed differently, how do you help the business see the value in onboarding? How do you position it as, hey, I know it's a little bit more work, it's a little bit more this and that, but their ROI is going to be there if we do these things?
Yeah, so I actually have a really great template and kind of framework that I share with managers. And if anybody reaches out, happy to share that. Really lightweight. It's not proprietary. It's something that I've just kind of picked up over my travels. And that's the key. It's really lightweight. So I don't even position it as onboarding. I say like, hey, here are some things you should think about before this person starts, because they're going to ask these questions. And here's how you can prepare your answers and really give them the directions to kind of hit the ground running. And so it's sort of reframing it, not so much as onboarding, because that can have a little bit of a connotation, like that it's going to be a lot of work, but reframing it as, hey, here's how you're going to make this person as successful as possible, and really giving them that tool, because that's half the battle, right? I think so many people that I talk to on a daily basis are using like stuff like ChatGPT for things like this. Half the battle is like, okay, I want to give my new hire a good onboarding process. What does that even look like? How would I even structure it? That feels so overwhelming. So this is what I share, is really just kind of like a plug and play of like, here's the questions you should be asking yourself in advance of them starting.
You mentioned ChatGPT. Curious, we didn't talk about this before, but I am now kind of curious about it. Do you envision there being, and I know there's solutions out there that are Gen AI onboarding based. Do you envision these type of tools helping in this scenario? And the reason I'm asking is there's a personal component to this, and then there's a lot of, you mentioned go look in this Google Doc, go look in that Google Doc, which is just surfacing information that's buried. Are there areas where an AI-based technology can help facilitate a better onboarding process?
I definitely think so, especially at a high level. If you're putting something together and you were to just say, hey, what would a marketing coordinator need to know before they start at an early stage startup? I don't know that they would be able to give you the information at this stage at your particular company that they would need, but they could give you enough of a framework to kind of get you going. I think there's very little in this day and age in a working environment that you couldn't tap ChatGPT and get something to help you. So I think it definitely could be impactful as it grew. And maybe there's an idea like this out there. Like if it knew enough about your company to know what types of docs you use on a daily basis, sure, it could spin something up probably in 2 seconds, right? I think we're a little bit away from that. But there's certainly an opportunity, especially on the logistical onboarding side, which a lot of people in HR are spending time on. There are a lot of HRISs that are doing just that, like really kind of automating that process as much as possible. I don't think it's really AI, but I think that same automation could be applied to something like this, because it really is a formula that you plug and play and do over and over again. That's kind of like what I want to emphasize, is it's not challenging. It just often gets forgotten about because we have so many other things to do.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I'm in agreement. I think there's a logistical workflow piece that probably can easily be tackled with some type of AI-based machine learning technology, because obviously a lot of the information is in your company. We just have to unlock it. When you're looking at weak onboarding and you're looking at situations, and this is interesting because if you're coming in maybe from the outside and you're coming in, how do you assess a weak onboarding process? How do you go about doing some due diligence to understand where those weaknesses are?
Yeah, it's asking a lot of questions. And oftentimes I'm asking those questions and there's no answer, right? So I'll say, oh, well, what do you do for a new employee's first day? Like, what does that look like? Oh, well, we've never thought about it before I leave. And oftentimes I'm talking to founders asking this question, and they'll say, well, the manager kind of handles that. And so then you know that you're getting a different experience for every new employee, which can be fine, but there's no consistency across the board. And there's no sort of expectation set by the founder to say, hey, we should be thinking about these things, right? And oftentimes, if we're not thinking about them, they're not really happening. So really just asking a lot of questions and digging into what does expectation setting look like? What does the first 30, 60, 90 days look like for a new hire? And if there's no answer for that, it's usually that they just sort of haven't thought about it. And I'll help them take it one step at a time, right? Like I don't come in and make this recommendation for a sweeping overhaul of everything, but I'll say, hey, when you have your next new hire, come to me. I'll share with you the templates. I can sit down and kind of walk you through what that could look like, and we can put something together. And I'm not generally saying this to the founder. I'll say it to the specific manager, just because they're the people that are kind of boots on the ground doing that on a day-to-day basis. And so then that's one time where they're putting a plan in place and then kind of executing on that plan with one new hire. They learn from that. They're able to iterate. So when they hire their next person, it's less work, right? It goes from being probably like 30 to 45 minutes to like 20 minutes. And then they're able to take what they've learned from that person and really optimize the experience too. So it's a lot of really just kind of data recording and holding yourself accountable for stuff like that.
You mentioned going obviously to the individual managers. At some point when you're looking at workflows and you're trying to understand, you mentioned consistency across experiences versus each one being slightly different. How much latitude is there to customize the experience based on the hiring team? I guess, obviously, an engineer versus a salesperson, there's some consistency, there's some variability, different roles, different types of skill sets. How much consistency can you aim for, and how much do you allow a hiring manager to kind of customize for what they need?
I think the consistency you want to aim for is that everybody is consistently thoughtful. I am not of the mind that it has to be an extremely consistent actual experience, that the activities need to be consistent from team to team. I actually think they should be really customized from team to team. But my goal is to make sure that there is an experience, I guess I'll say that. Like when someone is starting, there's someone who has put together some sort of a plan for them. And that's what I think of as onboarding. So there's a lot of latitude. And I think that there should be, right? Every team is different. Every leader is different. Every employee is different. And so they really should customize and make it their own, because the goals of every team is going to be different. It's a great question, though, because you want there to be consistency, but it's less about the actual activities, more about the feeling and that new employees are getting from the team around them.
Yeah, I think obviously you mentioned the consistency, and I think that's interesting because in a startup where documentation's light and you're adding new hiring managers, being able to have that hiring manager understand what to do, how the company likes to do something, versus they might leverage their own toolbox, what they've done in the past. They might not have that direction. I think that's actually I don't know how often it comes up, but I'm sure it is an issue. I guess when you look at a startup, and they're probably looking at this going, Amir has Meg on, he's telling us to focus on onboarding. How much of a time investment is this? Because it might sound like, oh, we need to spend weeks and weeks, or is this hey, you don't necessarily, you can, but if you're a startup, you necessarily don't need to? Or how much time is allocated to help improve or help establish some good, healthy onboarding processes?
Yeah. So I would say in total, 2.5 hours. And let me tell you how I would break that down. It's maybe 30 to 45 minutes before a new hire starts. Again, with the right framework, happy to share ours, but also ChatGPT, whatever tools you want to use to get you started. It's a little bit of just a brain dump and then presenting to the new hire. Then maybe a 30-minute meeting with them on their first day to say, hey, here's the documents, here are the docs, here's what I'm expecting, go forth. And then the remaining time is really checking in at that 30-day mark, checking in at that 60-day mark, checking in at that 90-day mark. Now, if you have a new employee, you're probably checking in with them more regularly than that, right? But this is the intentional onboarding check-ins to say, how are you doing with these goals? What questions can I specifically ask? Do we need to iterate on the original plan? That type of thing. And so when you think of that 2.5 hours over 3 months, it's pretty small. And it's meant to be lightweight, right? Like this is not your huge company orientation, very specific onboarding. It's meant to fit the earlier stage startup. But I think you can extrapolate that to some later stages, right? Because you're really just trying to kind of put some parameters in place, put that quick list of directions out there.
I love it. I think it's a good conversation. I think people that obviously do invest a lot of time in their hiring processes. You've brought up some great points in terms of spending a little bit more time on the onboarding, making sure that's buttoned up, making sure you understand what should or should not be tailored, I suppose. We have not finished or exhausted this topic. I'm sure we could talk about it longer, but also it's a great starting point if somebody does need some assistance. How can somebody touch base with you if they wanted to pick your brain on some of this onboarding conversation?
Yeah, sure. So I'm on LinkedIn, Meg Henry at Companyon Ventures. Feel free to connect with me, follow me, send me a direct, like an email message. Always happy to engage on there. Definitely reach out.
Well, I definitely appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on and talking to us about this. And that's for this episode. Back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, I think this was a great conversation. When Meg and I first spoke, I really was like, I've never covered onboarding. I thought this was a great opportunity to do that. And I think Meg had some great insights. She has a template. If you want to reach out to her, I'm sure she's mentioned she's happy to share. So please do that if you are in need of help. Also, like, subscribe, comment. Let me know how the podcast is doing. Share this with somebody else who is interested in improving their onboarding processes. And until next time, thank you and goodbye.